All right, so I'd like to call this January budget meeting of the CVSD board to order. I have two known adjustments to the agenda. We're going to add two discussion items. 4.2 will be a discussion of the Betcha contract for next year. 4.3 will be a discussion on formation of the policy committee going forward. Are there any other adjustments to the agenda that anyone has? Joan?
David, I just have an announcement about the CVU yearbook.
Okay.
Taking an ad.
Okay. Do you want to make that announcement?
I'll do it if you want.
At the end? Okay, all right.
Yeah, we can get going.
Are we doing a picture tonight?
Elaine last night.
We are, okay. So don't leave immediately upon the end of the meeting so we can take a photo. So, hearing no other adjustments to the agenda, we'll move on to next item, 3.0, audience and communications. Is there anyone here in the audience who would like to speak that on an item that isn't on the agenda? No? Okay. And so we will move on to item 4.1 in our budget work session. And Jean's going to give us a chat on revenue and do a pass out.
Yep.
Okay.
We got too many. Well, go ahead. Pass it on. Okay, thank you. So Megan, Jeff, and Mark, you just have to do this for the rest of the.
We're gonna slide. We're gonna slide. Yeah, we do not want that many eyes on us.
Passing notes.
Exactly.
Just be sensitive to the camera angle when you do move. So, if they're in the way of the presentation, could you just let them know? They're good. Okay. Yep.
Okay, so we're going to go through a couple things today. A very quick revisit on the board's goals. We've been doing this all along through the budget season, and you know it's working. So why stop a good thing? So we're going to kind of revisit the goals, but briefly. Board had asked for a risk analysis, so we'll go through that. We also have the post-audit fund balance, so I'll give you the update on that. Then a little brief update on expenses, some of the corrections and adjustments we've made since the last time we met. Revenue, which we haven't seen yet, and then the tax impact. Did everybody get presentations? So, so this is the board roles. I just kind of put them, you're used to seeing a two-pager. This is just all on one page. And just up here as a reminder, but also if you kind of look through these, I was trying to do a check mark, like what did we get done on our board goals? And some of them, clearly, I could say, yes, we've done them during the budget session, but it's also just a reminder that we're kind of going to what we'd call a year-round budgeting process. So some of the things aren't going to get done in the 8 weeks that we spend on the budget, but on a more thoughtful manner as we go through the year. So Lynn and I had a brief conversation about this, so what the board should be thinking too about what things are you expecting to a deeper dive on, say in April, May, June, whenever it's appropriate for us to bring them up. And they are on our work plan to have kind of budget re-discussions or deeper dives on things. The goals?
An example?
Sure. The third bullet there, it says the board provides direction on spending priorities through review of educational outcomes. So that would be something we wouldn't necessarily do as we focus for 8 weeks, but we'd do it later.
So that would be, for example, how the budget supports the moving towards instructional programming that supports our outcomes.
Right, or maybe just the reverse order of that. You're reviewing educational outcomes, and it could have budget implications that you would discuss
Okay.
for the
Thank
next
you.
budget. Does that make sense to people? Like the second to the last one is the board oversight of the special ed service planning process. You know, as when Megan did the special ed budget review, it was not a process review, it was a numbers review. And so if at some point, I think we have it, I don't know, like a 3-year cycle, she would go through, this is a deep dive of how we do special ed planning. I just put flashing the goals up here really quickly, but we do, in general, have a debrief of the budget process, and part of that would usually after March, after the March vote. And part of that would be looking at some of these goals and saying, did we meet the goals? You know, I'm looking through at least this page saying, since the board has accepted the superintendent's recommendation and Elaine hasn't come back saying, I'm gonna miss the goals, I need this money. Right now, you know, at least on this page, I would say yes, but, you know, as you go to some of the second page, things like, provide adequate resources at a cost our community will support. You know, there are some things that maybe we have to, cannot at this point say, yes, we've met our goals. But also the thing on the goals to think about as we kind of wrap up the budget is, are these the right goals? You know, because next year, before you know it, we'll be back into it again, and is there something that we should have been thinking about beforehand that we should correct for the goals for next year? And finally, on goals, this is just a reminder on our strategic model. This is just the model as it stood that we looked at it in October. The little arrow there is for the year that we are planning for right now, 18-19. We're going to revisit this. I'm going to put in where we actually have landed against these numbers, but just a reminder of what it is. And the other thing I just wanted to point out while we're on this page is you can see kind of in the middle of the page the fund balance application, that we're applying $1.1 million in the year we're in. The board asked to lower that down to $750 next year, but it's a pretty steep ramp. You know, if we're going to have a discussion about fund balance, but the ramp down from 750 to 250, that puts us in a $500,000 hole right off the bat next year. So when we do talk about fund balance, I just want people to have in the back of their mind that usually you try to have a little less aggressive ramp. Right. And you notice the number in the bottom right-hand corner, that's $1.1 million, which is about what our auditors would like us to keep as a reserve fund. Okay, so that's sort of the end of the overview of the goals and what the board's trying to achieve. Any questions so far? Okay, risk analysis. So just one pager on the risk analysis. What I took the request to be from the board was, what contingency are we holding? And then what kind of risks are we facing, and how would we address them if things went badly next year in one of those risk areas? So what we did was just kind of walk through the budget areas and address them kind of a little bit one by one. So in the regular ed salary and benefits, if you remember back a ways, I was saying that we had, so in the HRA fund, we were assuming a 75% usage of the HRA money. The guidance we had was a 60% usage, so we had some contingency there. I'm going to tell you that that's now gone, because when Mark and his staff went through the actual benefits elections, we had more families. Mark, how would you say more?
You had a number of people who joined the healthcare plans that weren't on it before, and
So change in benefits more, come on in, Ray, more, it will cost us more because of the benefits. So what we chose to do, rather than just add that on and blow the 2.3 number that you gave us, is that we took down the contingency in the HRA. So the HRA is now at 60%-ish. I would say that there is no more contingency in that bucket.
Can you, I was just going to say, can you remind us of the acronym and what it is?
Health
Because there
reimbursement
might be some people that are not
Reimbursement account?
familiar with it.
Health
Health
reimbursement
reimbursement
account.
and part of the new healthcare plans association was negotiated last spring and have been to the entire state.
And the mechanism, how the account is drawn from is,
People enrolled in our card that they can use at the state pharmacy to withdraw from the HRA. More likely is actually done in the background through Blue Cross Blue Shield. Bill goes to Blue Cross Blue Shield, which will then get sent to our HRA provider, who will debit out of the HRA what is to be applied. It's actually pretty simple to the front-facing part of it.
And part of our negotiated agreement,
Was for the HRA piece, but hopefully,
okay, thank you.
Yes.
Can you remind me again how 60% was sort of the number that?
So, Mark, jump it.
Our HRA provider said, who these number of companies, said the organization size, used to create somewhere in the 55 to 60 range. We had been budgeting at the 75% usage rate, so a little contingency. More people joined our healthcare plan, so we were using more HRA money.
Yeah, I get that, but I'm just curious on the 60 and whether our pool and the features on our plan in terms of where the deductibles are set and all that are line up with comparable, you know, if they're looking at it in a corporate environment and saying it's 55 to 60.
So the future planning associates who runs our HRA plan does both public and private. About the size, the pool, the number of people involved. The plans that were being put in through Blue Cross and Blue Shield are actually ones that they see in the private sector as well. It's just we're just using a larger HRA pool in the public sector, HRA funding in the public sector. So when they are talking about usage, so yes, they have some experience telling us that.
Okay. The second budget is just a reminder that we've taken into account all of our known retirements or exits, but if a teacher or a staff member were to decide to decline their contract and not come back next year and we hired somebody at a lower rate, that's an unknown. So it's it's a contingency, but it's an unknown value. I don't know what that number is, but we've captured all the known exits. And the third bullet there is that, as we've mentioned, is that we have removed 3 positions due to class size, projected class sizes, but we've only taken in the budget, we've only taken advantage of 2 of those because we're holding one back as contingency. Frankly, one of them's a kindergarten position, and kindergarten is always kind of a surprise. So the staff has been, the principals are aware of where we are concerned about class size and but the budget implications are off by 1. So I have a contingency of 1 staff salary. Okay. So far, so good?
I'm curious, so the principals, you spoke to them about that and they're comfortable with that kindergarten contingency built in, or?
Well, they're comfortable to the extent that they understand how we got to the numbers, and the numbers as they stand, they're comfortable with. They don't necessarily believe that the numbers are gonna end up there, right? And so, in a way, they would prefer that we just leave the kindergarten numbers a little bit lower so that they wouldn't have to worry about that. Because there is going to be, in the very near future, a process that is going to start reassigning people. And imagine the situation where a kindergarten teacher gets reassigned someplace, and now the numbers go up, and they add another teacher, and now the teacher that they had is somewhere else. And maybe they'd like that teacher back, but maybe the school that got that teacher says, no, we planned around having that person. So it's not without its complexity. It really isn't without its complexity. So they understand all of that. We had a conversation again on Monday about that, and what we will do in the process to ensure that it's as smooth as it possibly can be. But anybody that is like 1 inch into the conversation recognizes that there is a possibility for it to be not quite as smooth as we would plan it if we had total control.
But there is available money to hire an
Yes,
additional
I know.
teacher. It's
Yeah.
more the process of where people are going.
Exactly, and moving people around when you maybe didn't have to. I will say this, and I'll turn to Megan to make sure that what I'm going to say is absolutely true. We know more about what kindergarten kids are coming into our program now than we did in the past because of the Act 166 and the 3 and 4-year-old 10 hours a week. More parents avail themselves of that. We're in partnership with, how many programs is it, Megan? Like 40? 47. Over 350 kids. Close to 400 kids. We know where those kids are. So now we have a much better sense. So we're hopeful that the numbers aren't going to skyrocket in any one of our schools, but
Actually, we'd kind of like them to go up.
yes, that's the thing. Not in kindergarten, but not in kindergarten.
Not this year.
Not in kindergarten, not this year. Yeah. Thank you. That's true.
Yeah.
We love the kids.
Yeah, bring 'em on.
Just in a controlled fashion.
In a controlled fashion, with a little warning.
This year we would
Preferably
like
high
third graders.
This year, third graders would be good. Okay, so special ed. So as you probably know, Megan has to do the special, and Megan and special ed directors do their special ed plan. It has to be turned into the state in September. Because it's so early, we often held a little contingency. We held a little contingency when we did that. And since then, we've had 2 more kids move in that needed it. It adds up actually to more than 100, so we've used up the contingency and a little more. But Megan and I are pretty confident that we can find the difference. So I would say in special ed, we've used up the contingency we had planned for, but it's not anything that's going to make me come back and ask you for more money right now. Also, just keep in mind that special ed, if it is a very high needs kid, we get more reimbursement. If it's, we do get reimbursement from the state. So the impact to the bottom line isn't quite as much as if other things that could go wrong. All right, operations, just real quickly, in the infrastructure side, buildings and maintenance, we do have, we have time to reprioritize if something goes wrong in buildings, and man, have we had to do that this year. So there is a little flexibility, so I'm not worried about that. Anything that was so big that we couldn't manage it, just with reprioritizing the repairs and maintenance budget would be probably an insurance issue. So I'm not worried about that. Transportation and food service, I'm going to be quite frank with you guys, is that we don't know how we're going to execute to the budget, but I have enough information right now that I don't want to ask you for more money, right? So we're going to talk about transportation a little bit, but at the transportation we're holding flat, and we're pretty confident that we can come up with a plan that would fit in that envelope. Food service, I've told you what the risk is on food service, which is I could get down to the budget number, but our families may not want me to. But that's something I can't really talk to yet. I haven't had a whole year with my food service directors. That we're working hard to see how close we can get and deliver a high quality product. But there's a little bit of risk on that.
So where are the big losses coming from in food service? I mean, if I look at the numbers we had last week, I see things like our overall budget for food service, it's cost, the overall cost is about 1.8 million. And I see that in one of the FMRs, we lost $40,000 in a quarter or 40,000 year to date, I'm not sure. But where is that coming from? Are we ordering too much for Taco Tuesday and we're throwing it away, or?
And that's why I can't actually answer the question, because what I suspect is that there are the schools that are running more in the red have a lot of high quality food and a lot of variety, which takes staff and money. I don't think there's a lot of waste, and one thing that comes up often is the purchasing. We do purchase through a cooperative, so it's not like there's low hanging fruit on, so to speak, on purchasing.
Okay.
So I think it's
It's not like a frequency of ordering thing would help you manage waste, because that's covered. It could be too many SKUs.
It could be that some schools need to have perhaps only 4 offerings instead of 5, and some other schools perhaps should have 4 offerings instead of 2.
Okay.
But that's the kind of thing that I wish I had a better answer for you, but I just don't.
All right.
Another question on that,
Mhm.
are all the schools digitized so that at the end of each month you had X number of students eating hot lunch at Shelburne versus
Yes.
Charlotte?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, then here's my comment about fund balance. So, if you flip back, you would see that we were anticipating at the end of FY '18 to have $2.1 million. That was on the model down there. Do you see that? In the post audit, it's a little bit better than that. It's about $270,000 better. So we have about $300,000 more in fund balance than we had anticipated when we put the model together. And this is where I was kind of warning you, is that, yeah, you could put that right against the tax rate this year, but we have a big problem next year too, so may not want to do that. But as far as contingency concerned, just to keep things in perspective, is that as we, the fund balance is our contingency in a way, right? If we get into trouble, we do have money in the bank. It's not like we can't pay the bills. So it is this year it's a pretty healthy number. I think the net on the risk is that I've told you where the contingency is, which is not a lot. I think it's a tight budget. I mean, I like working with tight budgets. I like to have a budget so that I know that people that I'm trusting to spend the money correctly are a little bit worried about hitting it because they make sure that they spend it wisely. So I like tight budgets. I think this is a very tight budget, especially when the only contingency I can put my hands on is a position. You know, when we do manage hiring very tightly. So I'm comfortable with this. That's I guess that's what I had to say. But I know, Amanda, this was kind of your question, so I don't know if you or anybody else had more.
No, the biggest thing was the kindergarten concern that the principals have raised, and I think that having that one held as a contingency, if that works for them, that sounds reasonable. As you were talking more through things, Jean, I was going to go back to transportation. So if memory serves, we are asking the community for 3 new buses, which is what we typically do, and then 2 more for Charlotte, because we're now bringing them in-house. Is that enough busing, considering that we usually, how many, 5 in Charlotte? 5?
5. Mm-hmm.
5 bus routes in Charlotte, and we're gonna take over all those bus routes and try and extend the life basically of 3 buses that we currently have. And are we comfortable with that? Because I know you mentioned it last time, and I couldn't remember if that was like, yes, we're confident with that, or are you still looking into it?
It's a little bit. I might need another bus. It could be that I won't borrow for it. Like, that's one thing we're trying to figure out. Could we? I mean, they're $100,000. Could we just buy the bus? You know, that's the kind of thing because we have to buy vans and other vehicles, sort of smaller vehicles, on a regular basis. My bus director gets back from a long leave next week, and I'm going to have that conversation with him and look him in the eye, because I really think that I'm kind of with you. I hated to ask the community for 3 buses of 5. You know, I would rather try to do it with 2 buses of 5 to be conservative, but I also know that Shelburne has got awfully overcrowded buses, and I could be using my same contingency bus twice here. So I think I do. Thank you for asking that. I think I do have to have another conversation. I was just a little, frankly, when I looked at it and said we need to buy 6 buses, that was like 6 buses. That's a lot of buses. So 5 felt more comfortable to me, but I probably should have a more realistic discussion with Ken.
So okay.
That's good. Thanks.
No, I don't think she did. So when you were talking about the fund balance, I see you're still looking to apply 2.1. So are you possibly taking 300,000 and pushing that to reduce your $500,000 hole in the next budget year? Is that?
Yeah. So we're applying 750.
Right.
Instead of, you're going to apply 750 and then following year.
Perhaps only take it down to 400 or 500 as opposed to the whole way.
When we did the model in October, we thought our fund balance was 2.1. When the audits were done, we realized that our fund balance is 2.4. So we have an extra $300,000, right, that we didn't really know about. And I think what Jean is suggesting is to kind of keep that in the bank and make next year, instead of applying 250, we actually could apply more fund. We could take that unexpected 300 and apply it then.
That's what I was trying to ask, but I wasn't sure which number was which. So
Yeah,
thanks.
it is a little confusing.
Yep.
You see my notes on that, so I didn't get it mixed up myself.
Okay.
Is it a quick explanation of just where the other 300,000, where that discrepancy was?
Special ed reimbursements. Quick enough. Yeah, unfortunately, it was at CVSD, and that's the matching up of spending and reimbursements. We just as you just did the audits 2 weeks ago, and I do have a question on that, but I've 15 years I've been frustrated with how we can't get more accurate on, how the state can't get more accurate on what they're reimbursing us, but when they reconciled the books, it was better.
Colleen?
Jean, did you give us a net risk amount, dollar amount? Well, you gave us a series of figures, not all the dollars were attached, but you talked through it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure if I heard some of that correctly. For example, contingency for special ed, was that $100,000?
Yes, but it's gone now, so it's 0.
Oh, okay, so,
My known contingency is 1 kindergarten position, period,
And the fund balance.
and the fund balance. My risks, I guess I wouldn't really know how to evaluate them, but.
They're everywhere.
There's always risks.
Around every corner.
I thought I heard you say something about a dollar amount for a net risk.
Oh, I'm
That you
sorry.
had that.
No.
But it looks like it's 1 position and then the fund balance.
Is contingency, so that's on the positive side.
Okay, thank you.
So the single position that you're holding in contingency, I'm just curious, you have 1 teacher for 6 buildings, you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just like, is that really 1 teacher, or is it 0.125 of a teacher in 6 different places? I mean, I guess like if all the kindergartners show up, is it going to affect 1 particular building? Probably not. It could affect a couple different ones.
Well, you have to look at it at the numbers, but remember, because, well, you guys know better than I do, but it's because classrooms come in chunks of kids, right?
Right.
So when we looked at the forecasts and put them into the known number of teachers, you know, it could go 16, 18, 19 kids a class, but when it got to 20 in Charlotte, for example, remember we actually bump up to the 20 level in a kindergarten, and so we've added para support.
Yeah.
And what happened it's in Williston, is that their classes, if they come in as expected, their class sizes would be 16? 16?
No, 18.
18.
19.
If
They come in as expected, and that's the NESDEC numbers, and NESDEC does a little bit of a bump up.
Yeah.
But you can see that it wouldn't take long to get to 20.
Yeah.
And in Williston, it wouldn't make sense to do para support, because you'd have to put para support in, 5 classes? Or 6, right? It's much smarter to just get another teacher and then divide it. And
Yep.
Shelburne probably would be in that same category. Heinsberg and Charlotte, because they have 2 sections per grade, it's more likely that we would do para support. And it is a risk. We're saying like, oh, they're not all gonna come in the same year, both in Williston and Shelburne and
Yeah.
Heinsberg.
Okay.
So Williston did do a really good analysis of like over the last 5 years, how accurate has the projection been versus who showed up, and that discrepancy is big enough that there is a likelihood that they'll need another teacher, as opposed to other schools that could say, well, historically we've had 3 more kids show up, but that's not enough to drive another teacher, so we wouldn't put contingency there. So you know, it's hard. You're making try to make data-driven decisions. But the numbers aren't perfect.
I get it. I totally get it. And it's just like 2 towns could have an issue, and then you need 2 teachers, and you're saying we've got one of them covered, and
Right.
we're going to have to go into the
Right.
bank to
Right.
find
Yep.
money for the other.
And that has happened in our schools, in every single school at some point in the last 5 years.
Yep.
That administrators have gone back and said,
Yep.
it's August 1st and we have this many kids in 4th grade
Yep.
or 5th grade or wherever it is, and the boards have said, okay, well, we'll tighten our belts and we'll hire another teacher and we'll make it work.
Yeah.
But that's a board decision. That would be me coming to the board with a recommendation, showing you the numbers and saying, this is my recommendation. And then
Yeah.
the board would have the discussion and
Yeah. With the amount of construction in Williston, I mean, is that concerning for enrollment in, I know we love to have kids come in, but is that taken into account? Is there any way to analyze that? Do you guys ever look at that in the
Yes.
past.
Greg did a great presentation on it at the first, in November, the budget meeting, and it was a pretty big discrepancy, was it last year? We had like 16 kids coming between like August, September timeframe. And a lot of them are coming from Finney Crossing, the new construction. The state doesn't seem to give that enough of a bump, so I don't know. To Elaine's point, they're trying to build it in, so,
It's NESDEC.
Okay.
yeah, that's right, sorry.
Okay, so, I mean, just a reminder, it's a $75 million budget, and we're talking about 100.
76.
Thanks, Lynn. All right, let's see. So, on to expense. Okay, if we're done with risk, it's on to expense. So, little asterisks up on top, just to start there, the footnote at the bottom, which is that we've been kind of accumulating little things, because Mark and Miranda and I find something that didn't get put into Munis correctly. We've been making little adjustments here and there. So we do have a past due budget, but essentially, there's only a couple of key things in there. One is that we've added funding to the past due budget that was not in the first past budget for 1.5 school-based clinicians. These are social workers, they're a contract from Howard Center. It's what we've decided, and they're Medicaid funded. So they do go in our spending, but they're funded through Medicaid, not directly through taxpayer dollars, right? What Medicaid, we've worked pretty hard to get our arms around, with Megan, get our arms around appropriate uses of Medicaid and how we can best leverage that money for the good of our kids. And what we're going to try to do next year is use that money to fund our social workers, essentially. There's a few other things in there, but that's what it is, and it's really on the whole board, the social, emotional, the supports we need to give kids right now. That's where we think it's most useful and most appropriate for Medicaid, so that's what we've swizzled things around a little bit. And we found one of these is at CVU, and the other half position is undecided at this point. We have a couple of options that, if you remember, Elaine and Megan did the whole equity on the interventions, and there's moving parts in there. So when it all settles down, that's what we have in here for those. So those were added. The reduction of the HRA versus benefits, we made that correction, and then some minor cleanup actions, which were all reductions.
Jean, with those two positions, you said one you know where it is, the other not. If there is a need in any of the buildings, can they move, or is it going to be building specific?
So one of the things that we're trying to create by moving, right now just funding, but eventually also by function, how the social workers are allocated. So schools were spending their own Medicaid money, schools were hiring or contracting for their own school social workers, so that didn't happen in the past. And the hope by saying CBSD has X total number of social workers, here's where they are, they all need a home base. Social work is not the kind of position that you can willy-nilly move around. But I've had conversations with the directors of that program at the Howard Center to say one of the things we're trying to achieve is the ability to move a resource if we need to. It happens sometimes, one of a lot of benefits to using the Howard Center, one of the drawbacks is that there can be turnover. So, and it can take a long time to fill a position. So if we have this kind of organized model, they could share between buildings even short term. So the answer is that's the goal. Whether or not we'll be able to achieve that starting next year, I'm not sure, but that's part of why we want to put all the funding of the social workers together and by design with Howard Center go into it with, we're looking at this as a whole system. Howard Center hasn't been looking at it. They meet with Wilson's principals and Shelburne principal individually, and they'll still do that, and that's still the direct supervisor of it. So that's part of it.
Okay, it sounds smart. I mean, for our students to be learners, they need that aspect of their whole being. Sounds smart.
Can you give us the 10-second summary of how social workers are currently funded?
So about half the schools do already use Medicaid dollars. One school funds it out of general school has a percentage of it funded under special education, which we've, it's a good thing that we're not doing that anymore, because that really is a system support, sort of questionable as to whether or not that's allowable. And that's the array. So it's basically Medicaid or general fund, and a little bit of special ed. And by moving them all into Medicaid, because with the schools that weren't funding social work out of Medicaid, they were funding a myriad of other things, some of which we weren't sure really fit the priority spending of Medicaid. So really, we're just trying to align, Medicaid has spending requirements, and we're trying to align those. Social work is a really good fit for how a school would use those dollars.
Thank you.
Just as a reminder, Medicaid is really a revenue reimbursement. So we spend it in the general fund, we reimburse out of it. We just get reimbursed from Medicaid. So. Oh, hi, Barbara.
Identified criteria for the other half resource, like what is going on, what the school will require, whoever needs that other resource. Is there like an identified criteria, standardized?
Can you say again, what do you mean
Like,
by that?
we know one is going to CVU, right?
Oh, the other half?
But then the other
Pages.
half, it's
Yes.
unknown. So is there like a criteria for?
Yes. Do you remember, and I know, I'm pretty sure you were at this meeting, the meeting in Charlotte in December,
Yeah.
where we did the autonomy matrix, and we did the framework of interventions, and we had it divided into 3 parts.
Yeah.
The third part is the social emotional learning part, and it's in that part, and it's not equitable across the district, right? And so there are places that have too much of one thing, and other people that don't have enough of a particular thing, and we are having conversations. Even yesterday, we were having a big conversation with a subgroup of principals about, is this the year to do that? Right, so it's not that we don't know where it should go ultimately, it's that we're talking about human beings who are in positions, in systems that have a culture of their own. We don't want to discombobulate the system when it's working, but if we can move it along, that's what's going to determine where that goes.
Mhm.
If we can make some parts move earlier, then, because we always say, this is a 2 to 3 year plan. Are we going to do this in year 1, year 2, or year 3? Does that answer your question?
Do you have a question, or? You're good. Okay.
Okay, so the rest of the bigger bullets on here, after just talking about the changes that we made, you've seen before when we did the expense, right? We met the 2.3%, the salaries at 3%, partially offset by retirements. The benefits are down, though we switched it between HRA and healthcare. Long-term debt increase. This is just so you don't trip over this later. This 878 is the increase in the long-term debt budget to budget. You'll see a number of 837 on other pages because some of our other shorter-term debt is down. It's just, if you see it, it's not an error. It's just long-term versus total debt.
Jean?
Yeah.
So with this budget, is both the debt service for both Shelburne and Williston fully baked into the budget?
Yes.
So we won't see, unless there's some other bonding, we won't see an additional jump in that for the following year?
Correct.
Thank you.
Yep. Let's see. Just a reminder, we looked at equity on December 5th. We looked at the operations on December 19th, so those no changes that I haven't already mentioned. The innovation fund at $100,000 is still in this budget. The consolidation savings is $250. That's up a little bit from what you've seen before. Funny enough, I should say in this room, but the board costs, the costs that we have for the budget for the board itself, when Miranda had done the roll-up, it was more aggressive than I thought, and I was pushing back, but she's convinced me that there was a lot of duplication in there between the boards. So we're up to 250 cumulative between the 2 years. So we're on a roll. And all of those things that are on here will continue. So we're on our path to get to that $1.5 million over 5 years.
What could, no, I'm not gonna ask that, never mind. I just got chastised for asking about 80,000 on a $76 million budget.
Go ahead and ask.
You're the boss, Dave.
I think those are the important things when we had such hopes and expectations for educational delivery still being tops, but saving money with consolidation. So I think that's really important. And it's a neat thing to see. We knew it, we knew it in our gut. I knew it in my gut, but this is tangible. So I'm excited. And our
Getting there.
students are still centered and what we're working for.
Yeah, and frankly, the bigger savings, I'm going to say bigger, they're never going to be huge. But the bigger savings take a little bit more time, to work into staffing consolidations and contract negotiations and say the busing, things like that you can't just do overnight. So, but we're on a mission to get that number. Okay, so this is just the summary of the kind of a high level summary of the changes. Just about halfway down there, and I think it's just really important to keep your eye on the fact that if you left out debt service, it's a 1.2% budget increase, which is very fiscally austere. I think it was a tough thing to get to, and later on when we look at some numbers that aren't so positive, it's just we have to kind of keep in the back of our minds that this is a pretty aggressive number. So the debt service adds 1.1 for the total of 2.3 increase on spending, on expense. So you ready to move to revenue? So sorry for the eye chart. I think I gave you a full page blow up in your package so you could read it. Those of us with older eyes are starting to be sensitive to this kind of stuff. Okay, so here's the revenue roll up. I'll just walk through them. I'm going to look at my notes, so if you have a question, you might have to just say, hey, Jean, slow down. Just starting at the top, you see the fund balance that we had projected in the model. Impact fees, that's a pretty big reduction. Impact fees are money that is collected in Williston and Shelburne for the CVU expansion that we did 17 or 18 years ago. So it's like for 20 years, they collect a certain fee as houses are built in those two towns. The actual for last year was $100,000. So that's just what we plugged in. It's the two towns trying to forecast how many houses are going to get built. So that's the number that we have in here is the actual for last year, or the actual for what we think the current year is going to be. No, it's the actual for 17. Correct myself. Tuition is this used to be a huge number with St. George in it, but now it's just this year we have 9 kids tuitioning in. A couple from towns and a couple from parents who just chose to pay for their kids to be here. We took 5 of the 9 we looked through thought that was pretty reasonable, given the situation, but that we can assume 5 will be here. Interest is down a little bit based on what we're seeing now, but if you remember when we did expense, I told you that the TAN borrowing expenses were lower because the towns collect and deliver the money to us on a different schedule. We actually have to borrow less. This is tax anticipation notes. So that when the towns give us the money to pay our bills, it doesn't come in at exactly when we need it. So sometimes we have to borrow money in order to be able to have the cash flow. And while we borrow it, we invest it. So we get cost of borrowing the money and then we get the investment back on it. So we're borrowing less, so we're getting less on the interest. So that's part of the reason that that's down, kind of the offsetting. I told you that TAN was down, but it was going to get offset in revenue. Rental income or rental revenue is down. The vast majority of this is due to our agreement with our after-school program. It used to be called, what was Imagine last year. They paid us the agreement we had. No, so Imagine as an entity was part of CVSD. It was like food service or something else. It was an enterprise fund access. It's an enterprise fund. It had its own budget. It had its own management system, but they were our employees and they delivered excellent after-school programming to our kids. At the end of last year, they had a significant shortfall. They came up $50,000 short. Part of their expenses was to provide rental income to the schools. But in order to make up that $50,000 shortfall, the agreement for the current year we had to get rid of some of the rent, right? So part of the agreement with them also was, Bob Mason started this, but I agreed with them, is that the financial oversight of that enterprise fund was a risk that neither one of us were comfortable with anymore. So if you if you have kids in the after-school program, it became part 2. It has separated from CVSD. So it's now a vendor to CVSD, I guess you could say. But part of that separation is we kind of separated out all the, in-kind services we were providing and everything else. And so the income that we got from that program is down $70,000. So that's the. Brendan, that you didn't like totally absorb that whole thing just right?
Actually, it made a lot of sense.
Thank you.
Yeah, it did.
It did make a lot of sense.
Okay.
So, just for clarification, is Part 2 still owned by CVSD, or is that a completely outside vendor?
It's a completely outside vendor.
Who is the outside vendor?
Part 2
No, it's
incorporated.
called, it's got another name, starts with an A. After school
Partnership, yeah.
After-school partnerships?
Something like that, yep. And we intend to, now that it's separate, we intend to have some discussions starting soon about who that vendor will be for the next year. But we haven't really got our head wrapped around that whole thing yet, but there are other after-school providers who are interested, so.
So how do we determine what's a fair price for rent? I mean, if it's an arm's length third party, obviously they can't come and say, we'd like to pay a lower price, and we just say yes. I mean, we have some notion of what fair is, or how do we?
I don't, because I'm not sure that the Y programs paid rent at all, so it's.
They didn't
Right.
until Part 2 came along.
Right.
One of the ways that we'll be able to get a handle on that, though, is that because it's a separate program, we will be putting out some kind of
bid.
RFP. That's the process we haven't figured out yet, but we'll put out an RFP and we'll just say, well, okay, so how does it compare?
The interesting thing will be how you evaluate those bids, because clearly, the 70,000 isn't nearly as important as the quality of the programming
Right.
that we're getting,
They're
that the
gonna-
parents are paying for,
More
and,
of a
parents pay for it, right? We don't pay for it, so it's kind of funny that we're putting it out.
Right.
So it's a process that we haven't really got our whole arms around.
When
it
a
out at
program
all.
like this runs a deficit, are the parents paying enough? Rather than us dropping the rent, maybe it should be charging more.
So to be really honest, though, I think that we were getting a very generous rental subsidy.
No, that's
Yeah,
what
we don't
gotta
know,
figure out.
right? So that's what we decided, because this all came about last summer when the books closed, and it was too late to start all over. So we just said, okay, this is the deal. We're gonna continue with this. We're gonna lower the funding, separate the thing, and we'll go out to RFP next spring.
Do we
So-
have any comparables from the town renting our facilities at all?
It's different in every town, unfortunately.
That's what I thought you were gonna say.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay? So I think those are the hard ones, guys. So it gets easier going further down the page. The next big block there is special ed. It's down on $178,000. If you remember, special ed is almost flat. So it's, we didn't expect the revenue to go up. And the number of state-placed students for which we get 100% reimbursement, you can see that's most of the drop. So, but it's calculation on the kids that are in the school and the reimbursement protocols from the state. This little box in orange or yellow, this is a number that I have not gotten from the state yet. So I just got it flat. It shouldn't be very different, but I'm waiting for a number. So if the number does have to change in the next 2 weeks, you might have a slightly different number there, but that's why it's got a little colored block on there. I don't have a number from the state yet. The rest of it is all kind of small until you get down to Medicaid, which, as Megan and I were trying to say, is that this is a good solid bottoms up. We know what spending we intend to draw down Medicaid from, so we're pretty confident on that number. I can never remember what EPSTD stands for.
It's early periodic student, yeah, it falls under my area. I don't even use that term anymore. Now it's called MAC. Medicaid Administrative Claiming, which is a smaller pot of Medicaid money that we get not from mostly special ed service delivery, which is where the big Medicaid, but MAC comes from what your school nurses and school counselors are doing. They do a version of time studies and we get some
Towards the bottom there, grant revenue applied to budget. These are programs where the spending is in the $76 million. And so the revenue is here. There is other grant funding, like Title I, where we don't put the money in our spending. It's a separate fund. It has spending and matching revenue. It's over here. But Bob was on a mission for a while and I think it's got a lot of value to put all of the school spending in our budget and see it. So these two pieces are in our budget. You can see the IDAV numbers. There should be a slash in there with the pre-K. We're pretty confident that's going to be a stable number. The CY grants, this is sort of an ongoing crunch with grants for this kind of work. It's actually a 2-year loss. We forgot to record last year's when we lost a grant, but nevertheless, it's down for the kind of work that Connected Youth does. I think it's fair to say that we're going to take a little critical eye on the whole delivery of those services and see if this makes any sense. I mean, we have a bit of an infrastructure around these grants, and is this the best way to deliver those services to our kids? Add anything, either?
No, it's an ongoing conversation, because this isn't new that those grant monies are going down. And so we've had lots of conversations, and there have been some changes. So I think it'll be an evolution partly, but we are having that conversation. And it's connected to the whole intervention framework too, that social emotional learning part. How do we support all of our kids? And what's the best way to do that now?
And we have to sort out what are things that we have to provide and want to provide because they're the right thing, and what things are we providing because they're attached to the grant. And what infrastructure did we build around the part that's just attached to the grant? And sometimes those lines aren't clean between two things, so that's part of the conversation.
Does this fall into that whole new wellness piece too? That the wellness requirements for that policy, or?
It absolutely does, and the whole school, whole child, whole community, formerly known as coordinated school health, that's absolutely, and that touches all parts of our organization, from food services and nutrition to facilities to wellness and things we would more traditionally think about that, so, but to Jean's point, we have infrastructure around that, and we have to decide how much infrastructure do we need for
No cookies.
No cookies as a reward.
As a reward, we can punish
Cookies
kids
can
with
be
cookies.
there and you can eat them, but they're neither a reward nor a reward nor a punishment.
Right. You will eat those cookies.
I will gladly eat those cookies.
Energy bar. So this is the revenue. It will be the revenue unless that number changes, much, and that's all I have for revenue. So I'm ready to move into the the fascinating wrap up on taxes. Okay. So this is what I promised you earlier, which is the first 2 years of the model, and the ones with the yellow there is what our numbers roll up to be versus the model. So you can kind of compare how close we got. The first yellow block there, the 2.3%, that's with a little, thank God I didn't go to the next digit on this, Russ, but it's still 2.3%, so nailed that one. The fund, if you could keep going down, the fund balance application is at 750. That's the same as the model, which gives us the net ed spending. The local revenue was a little better than we had anticipated in the model, so the net ed spending is up 3.9%. So net ed spending is just spending minus the local revenues. So all that well and good. And then magically, the cost, so the next line, the bottom line there is the cost per equalized pupil, where you take the spending, net ed spending, the 64,990, and divide it by the very top number, which is the equalized pupil count that we get from the state. And through the magic of numbers, I don't know how else to say it, somehow the state calculations ended up giving us credit for 60 more kids, even though we don't actually have any more kids. It has very complicated It has to do with, so equalized people, just the really short version, is they take the actual kid count that we have, right? And then you adjust for things like poverty, they get a higher weight, and they get, secondary school kids get a higher weight. They take pre-K kids down, special needs kids get a little higher weight. And then, so if you're taking a kid and you're multiplying times 1.1, you end up with, when you do that statewide, you end up with more kids than you actually have bodies. So they say, well, we can't have that. We can't have, we can't have 700,000 kids when we know we only have 600,000 kids. So they just divide it so that they end up with the original number. I didn't make this up. So somehow in the...
It's like normalization and
true.
quantum mechanics, yeah.
So somehow in that, all of those data manipulations, without us, we don't have more high school kids, we don't have more special needs, we don't have any, there's nothing except the way that they divide at the end that accounts for these extra 60 kids. This number came to me about 3 weeks later than it should have, because the state was baffled as well. But they have checked it 10 ways to Sunday, and they guarantee, and they have frozen this number, and is the number we are to use in our tax calculations. So, hey.
Bonus.
6-0. Yep, the difference between 4068 and 4127. So because we're taking our spending and dividing it by a much bigger number, it helps the tax rate, our cost per equalized pupil, which is what the tax rate is based on.
So now we have really no idea what it's going to look like next year, right?
That's a good question. I really don't know. Yeah.
Sort of plus or minus 60, just
It's a crap show.
however.
Well, one thing you didn't say when you were saying that we don't have more kids, we don't have more kids in special education, do we have more kids in poverty?
No,
We
we don't. Not across the whole system.
Right, but doesn't this have to do with our early ed numbers?
It has to do with
And that our
them.
numbers our early ed numbers are stable because we've been in the business of early ed for at least a dozen years. So somehow, and you're gonna help me with this, but somehow when they add up all the numbers and with all of the weighting, and we're in that too, and then they do the division to normalize the numbers back to the 80,000 students that we really have, we benefit from that because our numbers aren't.
Our pre-K numbers are pretty stable because we've been in the business longer than most of the state. You know, when they went to this free 10 hours, the number of pre-K kids went through the roof, right? So the state all of a sudden is counting a whole bunch more kids than they were 2 years ago. So we think that, we and Brad James think that that's what's skewing the calculations. So that should stabilize, to Eric's point. I mean, but,
Right.
so we just don't know quite yet what that's gonna do to us next year. But hey, this year I'll take it.
But just to be clear, we followed the rules.
Follow the rules, I have it in writing.
Their own
I
equation.
double checked, I tell you, this is.
was the number that.
I spent 5 hours on a
Right.
Sunday trying to figure it
Right.
out. And
Figured it out. Jean sent some of us a memo that said, here's what I think is going on. And a week later, we got the memo from the state that said, here's what I think is going on, and it pretty much tracked.
And I didn't
So-
send it to Brad.
No, so it's not,
It's
like
not
one of these
Gene cleverly
crazy
gaming the
things,
system.
right?
That,
It really
darn.
is in how the numbers normalize.
Yeah.
I'm just sort of surprised also to learn that we don't have any more kids in poverty or special needs, because that's
Yeah.
what we keep hearing about at the board meetings, is we have sort of the social emotional piece is
Right.
becoming much more difficult to manage based on the demographics.
Right. So you know what the thing is, though, the social emotional piece is not, there's not a monopoly of those students with low-income people.
But I
That's
meant in terms of transferring to special ed, I mean, do those kids
Even
fall?
then,
Yeah.
I think that that's the piece. I mean, the trauma that kids are feeling is not all based around poverty. That's a big part, and for those, we do get. If there's a bump up, we see that.
It's because of their cell phones and social media.
I mean, there's just a lot going on. I mean, it's, yeah.
Right,
We're trying to figure that out.
Yeah, our percentage eligible for special ed hasn't changed. What's changed is the severity of need
Mm.
and the small shifts, but shifts in the types of disability categories that we see. So, and we, our eligibility numbers are lower than the state overall. But we see more challenging kids in the system, and we have plenty of challenging kids in the system who aren't eligible for special ed, to William's point. And that's all the work on the system.
While the numbers across the system are similar, there's been pretty good first started with Title I, the school who needed the most, their numbers have come down quite a bit, while other schools have come up, and they're almost indistinguishable now, the three schools that we provide Title I assistance.
Is it due to a different way of diagnosing or,
No, Title I is based on your demographics.
okay.
Not this past year. This past year, where the numbers equalized, it's been the same formula.
Free and reduced lunch.
So I was very careful about how I worded the number on the lower right. So when you get through this whole, everything you see on this page, it causes a 3 cent increase on the tax rate, 2.3%, 3 cents, a little over 3 cents. That's not the tax rate, unfortunately, right? So, but this is the part, one could argue this is the part that we control. Okay? So, unfortunately, the story continues. So, how the tax rate is calculated is, so down to the, down to that second, that 2.3 that you've seen before on the middle of the page there, that's exactly the same as before. How the tax rate is calculated is the state comes up with what they call a yield, which is supposed to be what $1 on the tax rate, and I'm simplifying to just talk about the tax rate. There's all sorts of different, there's people pay on income, people pay on second homes, but it's $1 on the property value, how much that would support in per pupil spending. So this is supposed to be the number that says that if you charged everybody $1 tax rate, not the $1.50 we're looking at, but the $1, you could afford $9,842 per student. That's what the yield's supposed to be. It comes out of the tax commissioner in December. This is the number that he publishes. It's not final. It's not actually final until the legislature finishes its job in May, but this is the number that we have and use for this calculation. And what you do is you take the 15,749, that's right above that yellow, and you divide it by 9,842, and that's your tax rate. So we're 60% higher than 9,842, and so our tax rate is 60% higher than $1. That's how it works. But and you get the $1.60 tax rate versus the $1.52 from last year, which is an 8 cent increase. I told you the other number was 3 cents. That means that this yield is worth 5 cents. 5 cents on the tax rate is because of the yield number. So we could take our spending down to 0 and it would still be 5 cents on the tax rate. The one other thing that our communities have, and this is a really hard thing to explain because it's a good thing, but the very bottom line down there, the second to the bottom line, this is our incentive for consolidating. It was 10-cent incentive last year. It's an 8-cent incentive this year, which is, it's 8 cents off the tax rate. It's also 2 cents less than last year's tax rate. So if you're just looking at year to year, it's another 2-cent increase. So,
and the way that thing works, if I understand correctly, is we're going to be looking at that 2-cent tax increase, what effectively feels like one every year until that goes away.
yes.
4 more years.
So I'm hoping the communications committee finds a really good way to explain that to people.
Right. Yeah, it needs to be a multi-year look.
So the pre-CLA tax rate is 10 cents. Any questions on that?
Which is a 7% increase in the property tax.
Correct.
Well, you gotta take into account CLA, that's the next page, because it's different for each town.
So CLA is, so just to explain CLA in this, sorry, this is one of Bob's charts that it was really important when all the cells were filled in for all the different towns. Now that it's only looking at the left column, we can probably simplify this chart a little bit. But what CLA does, it's an attempt by the state to normalize the value so that a town can't, so that I don't get a lower tax rate because my town has chosen not to reassess in 20 years, right? Or lower tax bill because we haven't reassessed. So what they try to do is they look at, anybody who can help me with this would be great, but they look at sales and they judge to see how accurate the town's assessment of your house value is. And they say, well, you're above or below. You want to have a higher CLA because what you're going to do is take that tax number and divide it by the CLA. So,
You want to be as close to 100% as you can.
right, or higher.
Or higher.
Right.
Yeah.
Unless you're trying to sell your house.
Right.
That's like that we don't want any more kids comment. Depends which lens you're looking through right now. So the CLAs they came out December 18th. You can kind of see them down near the bottom. And let's see, so Charlotte is really close to what they were last year, 0.7%, so less than 1% off. Heinsberg has got a big change, but they just went through a townwide reappraisal. So while the tax rate is different, everyone's house value is different too. So it's really hard for me to tell. I couldn't tell anybody what they're. Colleen and I both live in Heinsberg. Mine could go up, hers could go down, or vice versa, and it has to do with whether our house was reappraised. How it was reappraised. Shelburne's again is really, it's 0.2 off, so that shouldn't be a big issue in Shelburne. St. George is just a little bit off. That's not a problem. Williston has a problem. It was a pretty dramatic change. I talked to Rick McGuire. He says that they're considering an appeal. Towns are allowed to go and appeal the numbers. They can say, let me see what houses you looked at. Can I make a case that that's not, if somebody sold a $5 million house and for a lot more than it was worth, they shouldn't reappraise everybody in town isn't going to see that increase. So there's things that towns do. And I called Rick, we just got these numbers. It wasn't that long ago. And he's like, we're still looking at it, but there's a really good chance we're going to look at it. So I hope that that gets fixed. It won't happen before town meeting day. Unless it's a glaring mistake. They usually take a while. In fact, I just saw Shelburne appealed last year, and I saw the note came out in May with the new rate. So it takes a while because they have to crawl through all the towns who are appealing.
So would the Williston CLA from last year then have been 99.26?
Yep.
That's what that 4%
means.
is?
Yeah.
Well, this is a good example of why, when we have our communications, focusing on budget to budget, year to year is so important because of the vast differences from town to town. If you focus on tax rate, it confuses the conversation. Even though I know people will look at tax rate, but the total dollars raised, budget to budget, can be where we start our conversations.
Well, you're right, because just in the past 3 slides that we've seen, right? I mean, first of all, that pupil count, how can you even put that into language from a year-to-year perspective if you say tax rate and that is like an unknown quantity? And then these other 2 numbers. So, I mean, you can talk about exactly. And so
Budget to
it's
budget,
budget to
we met our
budget
budget
versus
goals.
a tax rate.
We came in below where the governor has
Oh,
kind of
that's
set
actually
a benchmark.
that's a good point. I meant to mention that. So the cost per equalized pupil in the middle there, the 2.3, the governor came out. Now this is not his most recent speech, but in December he came out and kind of challenged the education community to get that equalized pupil count to be no more than 2.5%. So
Yes.
he did challenge it. We did make that number. So that's a good point. Thanks, Colleen.
The Heinsberg number where, changed so significantly because of the reappraisal, the tax rate is down quite a bit, but I would assume that the grand list actually increased in
Right.
size.
So it may not
So
change it.
that, the average home is probably worth more than it was on the past appraisal. So,
Right.
effectively, your tax rate may go down, but your taxes probably won't.
Correct. Yes.
Does anybody know what the threshold is, at what point state law says that a town has to do a reappraisal?
Well,
I thought there's a time thing and then also a CLA trigger as well that might be independent of the time.
Is it the amount in your properties built or
I-
versus the amount sold?
I
I
don't
think it's a
know.
percentage. If you go below
90% or something.
yeah,
Mm.
it might be.
Oh, so it's that. Mm.
Right.
that would make sense.
So do you remember, as former chairs of local boards, do you remember getting a letter from the state every year that
Yes.
showed you what your calculated CLA was for the
yep.
town and what
Mhm.
properties they used?
Yep.
Do you know if the state is still doing that? Because I haven't received anything in the mail.
I got them, you got them.
I got the one letter now with all of them.
Yeah, we wouldn't see them now, right?
Well,
But that's
Dave
what this
should.
is, but
Yeah.
that's,
That's what my-
Yeah, I guess we would.
If I had
Yeah,
that, I
it's
could share
interesting.
it,
Yeah.
so.
I can definitely forward it to you. I got an email, so.
Okay.
Jean, I'm wondering, so our next budget meeting is actually in Williston, so I could see a bit of an opportunity for us to, I know it's only 2 weeks out, but try and pull more people in to explain in person why our effective tax rate is going to look so ugly, perhaps. Do we have any thoughts off the cuff on what we could?
I mean, how the whole CLA calculation is done, I would need help with that. That is not.
on his way to Florida.
I also
Equalized
think
grand
a lot of
list of
people in Williston are gonna understand this because their house properties have gone up $34,000 overnight, and there's a lot of people that are very upset. Sorry, that was my rant for the evening.
I think as a board, what I've come away with, and you know, a lot of you know, I'm definitely the proponent of at a price taxpayers can afford, and I will tell you, in Charlotte, this was going to cause a lot of people to not feel super supportive of our schools. But at the end of the day, this is what I've come down to. If you look at the overall tax rate, we only control 30% of it. To take out that 30%, and if you go back to the very beginning of this presentation, really our spending is up 1.2%. 1.1% of that is long-term debt. To take out the amount of money to get us to a flat budget is not going to make an appreciable difference in a tax rate. So I would focus really on the job that we have done and what we can control. And the other caveat to this is the yield is an unknown, right? That's going to change if we can ever friggin' understand what components go into the yield and how that relates. We still don't know what the governor is going to present to get us out of the hole that was dug last year. Is he going to look at ratio? You know, there's so many unknowns, which legislature makes it really difficult to be a responsible budgeter and a responsible school board, because frankly, we're kind of taking our best guess, and don't punish us for doing our work.
For consolidation, frankly. Because for 2 years, we went around touting that this was we would have this graduated tax reduction based on a consolidation, and to see this, even 2 cents, it's not, but it is a big deal, especially now. And that's kind of a little nasty thing to do.
When everybody, or when the majority of the, especially the big budget schools in the state, are all qualifying for this incentive, it was never going to amount to anything anyway. The only way that it was really gonna have a big impact was if you didn't qualify for it,
Yes.
you were gonna
Yes.
be paying for the other schools to get it. But as it is, it basically, you know, so many schools qualified for it that nobody really got a break from it, in my
Yes.
opinion. Some schools may have gotten penalized to some extent for it, or some districts, but it wasn't ever going to amount to, you know, this great big tax break for anybody. Not when everybody consolidated at basically the same time.
So to Lynn's point, we did do the math, and if you wanted to get that 3 cents down to zero, it'd be $1.4 million you'd have to take out, and that would give the community only a 7% increase instead of a 10. It feels a little overly heroic. Plus, okay, I have to put my old school board hat on. A few of us have been around a while, have seen several times now where we've done heroic things to try to get to what we've been told by the legislature, just to see them get blow up at the last minute. Never mind. I mean, I know Williston went through hell a couple of years ago on that. So
It did, yeah.
yeah. So I mean, I think we've had a conversation when we started, is that we know what we can control. We put a very fiscally responsible budget together, I think, and I don't know where else to go except to hope that the governor means it when he says he's not going to raise the tax rate, and he can make that 5 cents go away.
I think the one thing I would feedback to our legislative rep here, is it seems like if the work on education tax reform needs to be done, it needs to happen this spring for next year, not this spring for this year. Or it needs to happen over the summer for next year and not this fall for this year. So, and I know it's through
In
no
an ideal
efforts of
world.
yours, and you'll just, you'll just help us feed that back to Montpelier. And we've had conversations about this, and I trust that you'll help us out. But if you could feed that back to the governor, that would be great.
You mentioned the CLI trigger.
Dean, when it
Oh, so
comes,
just one follow-up, sorry. Russ, Colleen used this wonderful thing called the interweb, and she found out that CLA falls below 80%, then you have to read.
80%, wow.
So there could be big dispersion between the towns, among the towns, anywhere between 100% and 80%. So
But
the
that's the whole
CLA just
point
makes
of
it
the
very.
CLA.
That's the point of CLA, yeah.
So it's supposed
Right.
to bring it back to a par.
Yeah.
So I just had a quick question, just in terms of, you highlighted how, proportionally how much of, the tax increase is driven by the statewide number, right? That is sort of encapsulated in that one yield number, right? So it's hard to disentangle it, but
Yeah.
roughly speaking, how much of that is the movement of the teacher's pension funding obligation from the
Half-
general fund?
0.5%, according to the letter that came out in November. It was only 0.5%.
On,
Other factors, transfer of teachers' pensions to the ed fund, 0.5 cents in FY19. 0.5 cents.
So I'm saying in percentage terms, because they
Oh,
express
percent.
everything as a yield, so it's hard for me to think about cents.
Well, you're the numbers guy.
But what are they saying?
So Eric, actually, Lynn and I were, because Lynn asked me a good question, which I thought I knew the answer to, which we went to check and didn't get a consistent answer, but the yield is really supposed to be just about property values
And equalized
and
pupils.
equalized
Grand list,
pupils.
the
That's
statewide grand
yeah,
list.
statewide grand list and the equalized people. It shouldn't have anything to do with all these other factors, and we got conflicting answers on it, especially why would it drop so much if those two things are
And what factors need to change to have the legislature make it go up?
change it again. So we are continuing to
Figure that
figure that out. But I mean, that's literally what the yield's supposed to be. It shouldn't be taking into account the other factors, and that's why we're struggling with an explanation.
But to your point, because that is then what helps to fund the ed fund, but if there's a hole in the ed fund, if we just did the yield based on that, you would still end up with a hole in the ed fund. So you have to somehow,
So if we get an explanation, we'll send it around because it
Or
is
you'd only
interesting.
get $9,000 per pupil. 'Cause that's the other side of that whole, right?
Yeah.
So I think though what you're,
You don't get
there,
paid at all.
the governor, the tax commissioner's letter came out saying that taxes will go up like 9.4 cents. That, I think, does take into account his forecast of spending, and that's what I think where it should be taken into account. So that's what I had. So in 2 weeks, unless anybody would like to direct me otherwise, we'll review the warnings with these numbers embedded. I don't anticipate any changes except for that, with that one, one revenue tweak, but I don't think that will change the numbers substantially, so, that's what we'll have for the 23rd.
So we'll have a warning for the budget. We'll have a warning for school buses.
Yep.
We'll have a warning for fund balance.
Yep,
And we will have a warning for transferring
the construction.
facilities money to the construction fund.
Right.
And
Is there anything about the leftover Shelburne?
That's that
transferring.
Oh,
the-
that's the last
yep.
one. Sorry,
Yep.
the way you said it, I just didn't register it. Thanks,
Yep.
Dave.
Okay.
That's how Shelburne says it.
Nice job, Jean, thank you.
Thanks, Ron.
There was an email from the VSBA that went out today around 2:30 PM, I think, and there are a series of reports, and included in that is a letter dated November 9th that we all saw once already, but if you get your email from VSBA, you might want to take time to click on a couple of those links. And there's one that just goes through the tax issues addressing the state. That's the November 9th letter. And then there are a couple other legislative reports in there that are interesting. One related to special ed. And, yeah, and then there are a couple others, but,
That was the VSBA legislative update number 1. Is
yeah.
that right? Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's worth clicking on.
Are we done with the projector? Anybody else have anything?
I think we are. Yeah.
Tech support.
So the next item is the flyer and communications. Is that a conversation
Oh, well, I couldn't
led
do
by the
that.
communications committee, or?
Sorry, honey.
Yeah.
I was just reading your email to me about the communications committee.
All right, so the next item is communications and the flyer for the budget.
Yes, and so we are having another meeting this evening, right after this meeting, to discuss pretty much filling in what is the structure of the budget. Colleen and I met for a nice day after the executive committee meeting, and we put together pretty much a structural format of some of the components that we'd like to see in the flyer, keeping in mind that the flyer is a fiscal communication, not a marketing piece. And we're also trying to create something that has a structure and a format that can focus on the budget year to year, not as a tax instrument, but really like an educational, so that people can see year to year, this piece will be here and this piece will be there, and what are our budget goals. And it's a little bit, actually, I think it's going to be quite a bit different than we've done in the past, because it'll be, we haven't decided specifics yet, whether it should be 2 pages or 4 pages, but the components are building a narrative in and of themselves to how we get to where we go. I think with this budget, the size of a budget, it's important really to show the community sort of the clarity that Jean just gave us. Like, you know, it's a big number, but $100,000 still makes a difference. And 2 cents of an increase or decrease still makes a difference. So it's a bit challenging. And then as soon as we have one hard copy, I hope to get it out to the wider board for some input. We're looking at a February 22nd distribution date. So now that we've picked that, which I've just learned that Dave said that he agrees with that, we'll go backwards with the deadlines for the printers. And so that's what we're working on right now.
Yeah, Joe.
Joe?
I know that time is of the essence to get it well done. Voters vote early.
Yep.
The 22nd is right before vacation, right? What's the date of our February?
Yeah.
vacation?
Yeah.
Okay.
That week.
So I don't know if anything can
So
be
you feel
done.
that's too late?
I think if we had a stack in all the town offices, our numbers for early voting are up.
That's a good point.
I mean, certainly they were in the you know, presidential elections, but I don't know if,
So can we
what that
legally put
means.
it in the town clerk's office while people vote inside of the distance buffer?
you can have it in those shelving things or whatever. Yeah, you can have.
It's like an
you
annual
can have
report,
it.
it's not a,
It's not
It's
not
not a
a,
marketing-
It's
The
information.
other
Okay.
thing that Barbara and I talked about, because at CVU we got this complaint a lot, was that the flyer will be physically done, it just won't be printed and distributed, so we could put it online
Okay,
much
okay.
earlier.
You
Oh,
know,
good
at
point.
least,
Right.
I mean,
And have some in
certainly
the
not
town halls.
everybody goes away, but a lot do.
No, it's a good point. So here was my challenge, because sometimes when I send out communications and it's too far in
Early,
advance,
yeah, yeah.
people say, oh, I'll read it, and they round file
Yeah.
it. And so there was a kind of we had 3 choices, 19 days before, 12 days before, and 5 days before.
No.
And 5 days before is
Yeah,
way
okay.
too, and this, the way it falls, that February 22nd date gives us the 12 days, and it is vacation, but the other is like, 19 days, which seems I like
Well,
the idea of
maybe-
the information online.
Yeah.
And how to
And-
find the information.
And have
At
some
least
printed
for-
copies available for pickup.
At least for our families.
Yes.
You know, I don't think it's a typical vacation time unless it's connected with school people. Just a
Nope,
thought.
you're right.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. So we'll move on to 4.2, transportation.
I'm
Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you.
Let us know when you get it all
Or
worked
should I
out.
say thank you, Representative Webb?
Fix that for us, thank you.
This is just, we've kind of talked about it as a done deal, and we talked about it a little bit in the spring, but currently, Betcha Transit does our transportation for Charlotte. Bob commissioned, and the board commissioned a transportation study last year that said there would be some small amount of savings. I'm not entirely, it's such a small amount, I'm not sure I would say anything. I would say that it's not a hurt for us to bring that transportation in-house. Betcha's been a good partner, but I do think that equity-wise and management-wise, it's the right thing to do to bring the Charlotte transportation in-house so that we have one transportation director, we can share drivers, we don't have two systems going on. So this will be on the agenda for the board for the 23rd to agree not to let Betcha Transit know that we don't intend to renew our contract at the end of the year. My transportation group is very comfortable with that. It just leverages what we already have, and I think I'll find some savings out of it, but I can't guarantee that yet. As I said, we just planned a flat budget, but I can't put the buses on the warning until we make this decision. So I don't know I can send you guys the link to the transportation study if you want to look at it again, but unless there's more information that you'd like me to send out. I just wanted to make sure, usually we discuss things before we vote on them, so this is your opportunity.
I'm not clear what the question will be for us. And perhaps I was spacing out, so.
Oh, well, in 2 weeks, I'm gonna ask the board to approve bringing the Charlotte transportation in-house instead of outsourcing
Okay, so that'll be the
for
question.
the next fiscal year,
And we'll have rationalization with, some kind of criteria behind it, or?
The criteria behind it is that we have an outstanding transportation department, and we feel comfortable we can bring it in-house and ease management, decision-making, and not cost the district any more money and potentially save money.
And keep it in line with other.
Yeah.
Consistency, I think, is important.
I think it was the natural step that we discussed for consolidation anyway, right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Even this year, as everybody's struggling with getting bus drivers, there's been several times where Charlotte's had to, Stephanie's still here, has had to call to say, can you guys help us out with busing? And, Ken's been able to, or Barry's been able to find bus drivers, but it would just be easier if I had it on the schedule and I knew that I had drivers, and rather than, our kids can't go ski and ride unless you find me a driver. So that's what I mean by kind of management things. But I can't promise a lot of savings. Betcha's a very good company, it's very well run, it's a big company, but I'm pretty confident it won't cost us any money and they'll make things smoother and more consistent.
To me, the better question is can anybody give us a reason why not to do this? Why do we want to run two systems?
Well, and in fact, the only reason you're allowed to run two systems is because you merged. That was one of the carrots of merging. We wouldn't force you. If we had not merged, we would have had to either go all to Betcha or all to our system. The thought being that there's one of those that is a better way to go, and we should all be doing it. It was kind of one of the ironies of the merger, carrots and sticks, that
I can think of a reason why to do this, and that was like a vendor that tells me negative impacts to my program one day before school opens when they had lots of time to figure this out. A government program that is you notify one day before the design review that you're 3 months behind schedule. That, in a real life example, that doesn't work, and that's essentially what this vendor did to us. So that's definitely a reason to have control over the whole system in-house. We don't spend an awful lot of money on our transportation versus Betcha spending money on transportation. So
Comes down to renting a bus,
Yep.
putting the fuel in the bus, and having a driver for the bus, and
Yep.
insurance for the bus. So a
Yep.
lot of the costs will be the same.
Yep, that's great. So this will be on our agenda in 2 weeks.
Yeah, if anybody thinks of a real solid question they want me to have data for, just let me know.
Yeah. And usually we gauge these things like there isn't a large number of protests, so I would recommend that you proceed with your budget articles using the assumption that this article would possibly be approved. Or
Awesome.
this decision would be approved, and so you could draft an article for 3
I just need to find
buses
out if
to
it's
be
2 or 3
purchased.
buses.
Yeah. 2 or 3 buses, okay. If anyone disagrees, then they speak loudly now. So we'll move on to, was it 4.3 or 4.4, which is a discussion on formation of the policy committee. And this was a request by Russ. It's an accumulation of issues that we've come against through consolidation. I think it started, I had some examples before, but we've had disciplinary hearings where we want to review that policy. We've had expulsion policies where we want to review educational delivery.
IT policy.
Oh, that's the one that I
Yeah, I
forgot.
knew you were
Yes.
struggling for it,
So
yeah.
we've had issues come up with use of third-party software and privacy concerns, and we need to address that. So we need to create a policy committee. What I've heard is that possibly we would have maybe 2 members of the board on the committee. Mark would be a member of the committee, and I'm open to any suggestions for how else that would be. This is a discussion.
2 principals.
2 principals,
And
okay.
I've got names of people who have volunteered to serve.
Okay.
So that sounds like I'm not a member of the board, so this is just my opinion and what I think would be most efficient, but I think that sort of structure sounds right, a smaller committee, including administrative, probably one from at the high school, one from the K-8s, and board members that are really looking to read lots of words closely.
So Ray and I served on policy committee before, and we had 5 board members.
We had quite a few.
One from each
Yeah,
board,
one from
probably.
every.
One from each board.
Again, I'm only
So
suggesting.
I would
Sorry, it's
advocate
your
for
committee.
more than 2.
It's your committee. I'm just suggesting a
Only-
smaller number would be more efficient.
Yeah, I mean, I think more brains are better, up to a point.
Up to a point. But I've found that having,
Well, and also recall the older policy committees were drawing from each individual board.
right.
And I can tell you that Cindy at some times pulled her hair out because she couldn't ever get people there. So that's the other piece. It would be, the most important thing is, do people want to serve on this committee and do this work? And if it's 2 of you, great. If it's 3 of you, great. If it's 4 of you, great. But to put an arbitrary number and then people don't show up and then they're on the committee and they think that their schedule should have accommodated them, that's,
Okay, Lynn?
I guess I have a bigger systems question, because we have called ourselves a policy board, so, and maybe it helps solve the question of how many people are on a policy committee. What's the interface between the policy committee and the policy board? Are we gonna set it up
Right.
like we were back when we were 5 individual boards, where the policy committee would do all the deep work and we would just come back, look at it, review, give input, give it back, and then approve it? Or is there more conversation at the board level? Like, what is it that we as a board want to do with policy?
I think that there is a certain amount of nimbleness and ability to dive deeply with a small policy committee, which in no means discounts the need to have large conversations and long, detailed conversations at the board level. But I think there's going to be certain parts of every policy that are not going to be addressed, and certain parts that are smaller that are going to need detailed attention. So
Yeah.
I think it'll stay the same way it was. and I would recommend it be that way, where policy committee does the deep work, comes up with, input from staff, input from legal, input from what we feel the, citizens would need in this situation, and then discuss it. Brendan, go, sorry.
Well,
you've-
I can give you an example of where it's helpful to have a smaller group versus 18 people. You know, when we saw that the weapons policy, for example, needed some revisions, you know, if a kid comes to school with a table knife, a jar of peanut butter, and a loaf of bread, then all of a sudden, you know, the policy, the blade is longer than 3 inches, you've got to go before the board, and it was ridiculous, and we all knew that. So the policy was changed and to get to the word intent, but to get to adding the word intent related to weapons use, it meant going through, well, what are the federal requirements for a weapons policy? It's not something we can choose to get rid of. Then it's, you know, what does the state have? What does it mean for principals at the K-8 level, the high school? So there's this thinking through the process, and it seems like a, you know, silly discussion, but surprisingly, things pop up in that group that you wouldn't think about just because of the different perspectives around the table. And then we were able to amend the policy, bring it to the board, have that discussion. Okay, we saw that there was an issue with the efficiency of this policy. It was creating work where there didn't need to be work. We're still attentive to the federal issues, federal guidelines. These were the issues we talked about, and this is our recommendation. So we got rid of all the clutter, and we were able to streamline this discussion with the board. So I understand. So I agree with you that because we're a small board, 12-member board, running a $77 million operation, 76.7, round up to 77.
Rounding up or down?
75.
It's,
No, I just, it was the bigger question of, as a new board, consolidated board, what role is policy gonna play in it? And
a
it
lot,
kind
I
of then
think.
drives.
I think a lot.
You know.
Brendan, you had a question?
Yeah, I just kind of want to echo what everyone's saying. I was originally on that policy board, and I was one of the people who couldn't get to the meeting on a regular basis. That was definitely happened. But also, when you're talking about policy and you're talking about such things in detail, when you have a lot of people around the table, work just doesn't get done. So I would almost recommend that we have a smaller committee to work on that, and then bring it back to the board, and we can approve it or send them back to do work.
Okay. I saw Russ and then Eric and then Amanda. Did you have something, Russ?
I was just gonna say that with several of these, I think there's a lot of urgency to getting them done, that some of these policies, you know, I don't know if they're 3, 4, 5 years old, but technology has already made parts of them obsolete and or insufficient to address situations that I've seen us run into, particularly in the high school with disciplinary policy, where these policies aren't anticipating things that we're experiencing today. So there is urgency. So if that speaks to having a smaller committee rather than a larger one, to develop these things quickly or to adapt them quickly, I would be in favor of that approach.
Eric?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of good reasons to have a smaller committee. I think, just to Lynn's point, maybe a different way of sharing that outcomes with the board. In other words, instead of like getting a 90-page verbatim every word of the policy the night before in the packet that nobody can read, a nice executive summary. You know, here's just a one-pager on each policy with what the important points are, so the board has material that's meaningful to them, and then you can have a real discussion.
Let's get Amanda and then.
Yep.
Yep.
So I was also thinking, we have 3 existing committees, and there are 12 of us, and so this is more of an advocacy for smaller board. And also, if we're going to set up a policy committee, I know in March we're going to have some elections and possibly some new faces, and we might address all the committees, but I would want us to also consider, if somebody moves to the policy committee, are they leaving other committees, that type of thing, because we don't want to burn people out. So it's just, I don't want to open the can of worms now, like, are we going to reassign all the committees, but just in the back of our minds, maybe ramp it up, start it small, and then in March we can have a larger conversation about, is it working small? Does it need to be bigger? when we redo all the committees.
I envisioned this as an addition to your regular committee work. So that it wouldn't mean board members leaving their committee, it would be board members who are interested in policy, that they spend time with the policy committee in addition to regular committee work.
There's no rule that says we can only be on one committee. You could be on 3 if you're crazy enough.
Right.
The structural piece of that is that we, when we're not in budget session, once a month, we're having committee meetings. And so that determines how many committees you can have meet that one time a month.
Right.
And earlier, this board decided that the policy committee would meet separately during the day, maybe have the flexibility of having a little more time if they're digging into some big thing.
First thing in the morning.
Yeah.
That's where it met usually in prior years, and that works for having administrators on board somewhere.
At the central office, right? I mean, I receive.
Or CVU,
Or
which is a
CVU,
central
right?
Central office is
Yeah.
CVU, yes.
So, to your point, Eric, I thought that the charge might be something like the policy committee reads, digests, determines what needs to be done, and then determines what needs to come for a big discussion to the full board and what needs to just be that one pager. So then the board can wrap itself around, because I think about like the 2 examples that you gave us, there probably will be a need to bring it to the board and talk about like some individual pieces and say, here's why the policy committee is recommending this, and here are the conversation, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've heard 4 versions of keep it small. I say keep it small, so that's 5. So I think.
You count twice.
No, I don't. But, so I'd recommend that we vote on a charge at our next budget meeting. What you had is a good start. 2 members, 2 principals, and Mark is our Director of Labor Relations, Policy and Legal Services as the 5th member, and we'll go from there.
Can we just gauge like interest? Because I mean, quite frankly, if there are 4 board members, I wouldn't be opposed to having 4 board members doing the work.
Right. So
But I mean,
there's always gonna be 2 of them.
yeah, I think the administrators need at least building level KA and, someone from the high school, central office representation. Megan, I think Jeff, I know you were on the policy committee for a while. Ray, but the administrative representation is absolutely essential. But as far as board members, to me, if there are 4 board members that want to do it, let them do it.
Sure.
But I could be convinced otherwise.
Well, if there were 4 and and the board decides we only want 2 on it, then we'll have to have a mechanism that says, okay, here's how we're going to run for election to the policy committee. I don't know that would happen necessarily.
Especially not after the second or third policy meeting.
Getting an indication of interest, who might be interested in serving on it.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
That's
Send
great.
Dave an email if you're interested in doing this important work.
Yeah. And the action we'll vote on will reflect any input I receive.
And speaking of important work, I neglected to thank our budget buddies and let them know that they don't have to sit through the rest of the meeting. They're absolutely fascinated. But
Any of you want to be on the policy committee?
thank you very much. And just so you know, we don't normally ask budget buddies to come back. You don't need to come back on the 23rd because as it stands now, we'll just be voting on the numbers that you've already seen. So I know we didn't give you a lot of opportunity to chime in, though most of you weren't too shy. But if you have input that you didn't get a chance, or if you have input on the process, maybe you can reach out to me or to Lynn, and we can just distill it down for the board. But I know it's a lot of nights out and a busy time of year, so
Yeah.
thank you very much.
I can't go off my ride. Yeah. Yes, thank you. Thank you guys very much.
All right. Were you raising your hand or okay? So.
Oh, Oh, okay, I had a
before-
question, sorry, policy, it was, so, if we would rather not sit in on all policy discussions, but maybe have input on like 1 or 2 policies, or something like that, could we join for just a discussion around that policy?
So, I mean, Ray could speak to this, but what would happen in the past if a board member had a particular interest in a policy, you know, you would know ahead of time what the schedule of
Right.
policy
I
review
remember
would
that.
be.
Yeah.
Then you provide your input to that policy, and whoever's going to the meeting, they can be sure to represent your voice.
I see, okay,
Or you can come to the meeting.
Or you, yeah.
okay.
All right. So you had an announcement about the CVU yearbook?
Yes, and for many, many years, the CVU board has taken out an ad congratulating the graduating class. It's the only time that I know that I ask for money. It's about $12 a person, $13 a person. And last year, because we were the last official CVU board, we did a picture and all that. And so as a consolidated board, what do we want to do? And I saw Carol Fox last night when I was leaving CVU, and she's the administrator for the yearbook. And she would love a picture, and I didn't know we were having a picture tonight. And people
Brenda, did
can
he dress
pay
up?
or not. I think it's important to do that. What?
Brendan knew it was a picture night. Look how dressed up he is.
At least somebody dressed.
So if tonight's picture or whatever, I have always done it, and if people want, they reimburse, but I think it's important. I don't know now, though, if the pre-K 8 buildings have yearbooks that I mean, I know they do, and do we take an ad in every one? Then it would be more. So, whatever.
Yeah.
People want, but that's, one
So
thing.
you'll be collecting change from us.
How much, Joan? It would be good for people to know.
About $12 a person.
$12 a person.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, 12, 13. And again, if we wanna do that for the CVU yearbook, we can maybe use the picture for tonight, from tonight, or Carol said she will come to our next meeting, and did we know the date? Not Williston, the one.
February.
Okay.
February.
And that's right at her deadline for yearbook stuff.
She's the one who took the picture.
She should be able to.
Yes,
Taking a
yeah.
picture of me. I don't know. We don't have a photographer here.
I don't think we're doing a picture tonight.
Yeah.
Well, I was just gonna use the iPhone because Barbara Ann leads it for the
Oh,
webpage.
okay, so
Just
they
to-
would have a picture
Okay, okay.
tonight.
So we'll
Yeah.
figure
If that's
we're
the
gonna
one,
use
or
the
Carol
same,
will come.
whatever, yeah. And I have one other little thing too.
I don't know, you only asked for one.
Yeah, because I was holding my
Oh,
cards.
okay. Go ahead.
Since 1992, I've served on Shelburne and CBU, and I'm not gonna be on the ballot this March. And it's the right decision, it's a good decision, but it's a heartfelt, loss for me, because you people are important, and the work that we do is, in my mind, key to the world. And so I've been toying, never seriously, and I am serious now. And actually, one of our budget buddies, Barbara Martin, is interested and had come to me, and we got talking. So I mean, anybody can run, but Barbara is interested and has petitioned. So I just have to say thank you to everybody.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
I just have to say, as a long-standing board member, I am so appreciative of Joan's continuing mentorship of me and other board members. And I guarantee that we'll find jobs for you going forward. And you've just benefited so many of our communities in so many ways, so thank you very much, Joan.
Thank you.
All right. So take a moment and then can I get a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion approved. Our next meeting is January 23rd, and that will be at Williston. I would like us, I think our next meeting in February is still on the third
Yes, Tuesday.
week. It does not interfere with winter break because winter break spills in March. And so we'll see everyone on the 23rd. We will take a quick picture once we are done, but hearing nothing else, can I get a motion to adjourn?
Just real quick.
Yes.
At the next meeting on the 23rd in Williston, we'd like to offer a bit of a walk around to show what construction's occurred so far. Right before the meeting.
Like 5:30.
Yeah, like 5:30, so I'll send an email out closer to the meeting, but I just wanted to let you know.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. So you get a motion to adjourn?
Vote.
Second.
We're adjourned.